Welcome to a special edition of Firearms Friday. I'm historian Evan Green, and today I'm a guest at the Wyoming Pioneer Memorial Museum in Douglas, Wyoming. We're about 130 miles north of Cheyenne. And with me today is Doyle Evans. Doyle is a jack of all trades here at the museum. They have a very small staff and do a really fine job of interpretation and display. I'm really impressed with what they do here, and they were kind enough to agree to let Dean, our videographer, and myself come up here and look at some of the firearms in their collection.
So we're happy to have you.
I appreciate it, Doyle. So what do we have here today? What is this?
This is a Model 1865 Spencer carbine.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of background on the Spencer. It was a Civil War era repeating rifle.
Mm-hmm.
It is lever action. It has a 7-round internal magazine here in the stock.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I can take the magazine out without messing up our balance here, but it was not necessarily the fastest thing to reload, but during the Civil War, going up against 58 caliber muzzle loaders, it's debated how much impact it actually had on the Civil War. But individuals like George Armstrong Custer was a fan, President Lincoln was a big fan. I saw that apparently even John Wilkes Booth had one in his possession when the law finally caught up with him after the assassination. And it hung on for quite a bit longer into the Old West, into the Wild West period. The Indian Wars especially, which is kind of where the really interesting alleged connections to this come from.
Just one comment. You mentioned the reloading through the tube in the butt,
Mm-hmm.
and there was during the Civil War. I think there was an accessory called the Blakesley box,
Yes,
which held numerous 8 or 10 of those preloaded tubes.
6 to 13,
really?
Somewhere in there. There were a few different.
Yeah, so you just took out the empty one, pulled one out of your Blakesley box, and reloaded.
Yeah, kind of like ripping open a pixie stick and dumping it in.
Exactly.
But yeah.
So anyway, you were talking about now we're out on the western frontier.
Yes. This particular one is not a Civil War period gun.
Right.
It is a Burnside contract Model 1865.
Right.
So it would have gotten to the Army after the end of hostilities there.
Right.
But it would have ended up in Army service in time for some of like a Red Cloud's War and some of those chapters of the Indian Wars.
Right.
And now, before we get too much into the Fetterman Fight, we have to go a little bit over like the Bozeman Trail.
Right.
After the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie established lands for each of the tribes that were on the plains,
Right.
there was a clause in the treaty that said that the tribes had to let the U.S. government build forts, roads, and other similar improvements on their land if the government wanted to. This was agreed to as being acceptable. So one of those trails was the Bozeman Trail.
Going to the goldfields in Montana.
Going to the goldfields in Montana, yes. Now, the Bozeman Trail didn't have quite the same protections as the Oregon Trail did. There were clauses saying that they had to give, the tribes couldn't interfere with travel on the Oregon Trail. No such protections existed on the Bozeman Trail. But the government was allowed to build forts to help defend the trail and the people going to and from Bozeman.
Right.
So one of those forts was Fort Phil Kearny, up near present-day Sheridan,
Right.
Which was established, according to my cheat sheet here, July 14th, 1866, by the 18th Infantry under Colonel Henry Carrington. He had about 400 troops in his command by the time he made it up there. a pretty considerable number of civilian contractors.
And women and
Like
children.
that. Yeah, women and
Women
children.
and children.
A 35-piece regimental band. The whole kit and caboodle. They got up there July 14th, 1866. The first raid by one of the native tribes that was hostile to the Americans happened 2 days later, on July 16th. And that was something that would happen multiple times for the rest of 1866. There were approximately 50 by the estimates that I found. One of the popular tactics was, one was just hit and run. Come in, let loose a few arrows, see what damage you could do. But one of the more sophisticated ones that worked many, many times and met with much success was the Arapaho and Lakota would have varying sizes of raiding parties, and they would have this little decoy force that would lure out some number of Americans, and then they would come in and either attack that force with their tribe, with the larger force, or either the force was drawn out or the force was being drawn out from. So in this case, one of the popular targets from Fort Phil Kearny was the timber train, bringing wood back to the fort.
Which they needed for construction, cooking, and heating.
Yeah, any number of things. So it was pretty vital. It tied up a lot of resources trying to defend it. But nevertheless, there were still, according to my numbers, 6 troops and 28 civilians had been killed by September 27th of that year. Wow. And hundreds of horses, mules, cattle, and pieces of equipment had been taken. Yep. So it was a pretty good way to harass the fort.
And what was interesting is that the Army command sort of characterized duty along the Bozeman Trail to Carrington and his troops as like a picnic. It's going to be fine, right? And as you said, within 2 days they got there, they're under attack. Pretty much continuous attack.
Oh, yeah. And, yeah, like I said, this went on until the winter of 1866. Now, Colonel Carrington was playing a very defensive role. He didn't want to go out and send troops out on these proactive attacks against the tribes, and decided to just sit back and to try to buy time until more reinforcements could come in.
He was short of men, he was short of ammunition, he was short of all sorts of supplies. Kept asking for it, and they weren't responding. The Army wasn't giving him what he was asking for.
Which, from his perspective, I could make sense of it. But for the men under his charge, such as certain Captain Fetterman, who would become attached to his command later, it was very, very frustrating to see all of these people go out and get killed, and see the colonel just sitting there, seemingly just letting it happen.
Carrington was in the Civil War, but he was primarily an administrator. I don't think he never commanded a military force in combat in the Civil War.
Right. That's my understanding as well. And Captain Fetterman was quoted as saying, "Give me 80 men and we could ride through the whole Sioux Nation." That might be apocryphal, but it still sums up some of the attitude of the time of both underestimating the power and willpower and actual military prowess of the natives, and also overestimating the capabilities of the U.S. military, and also the frustration of just wanting to do something.
Right.
And in fact, I saw that even some of Carrington's higher-ups commanded him to go and try to take a more proactive role in actually bringing the fight to the enemy instead of just letting them bring it to him. Yeah. And he kind of tried that, didn't really work, said, okay, let's wait, continue waiting, see what happens. Meanwhile, this coalition of tribes decided, okay, let's get one last big fight in for the winter before we split up, hunker down, ride out the winter. because they knew better than anyone how harsh these winters could be up here. Let's do one last job.
One more, yeah.
So they decided to build up a really big attacking army, hundreds of men. I saw by some estimates, over 1,000. Decided to lie in wait outside of Fort Phil Kearny, and then on December 21st of 1866, they did what they've done multiple times before. One of their small decoy outfits came in and harassed the train.
The wood train? Yep.
The wood train, yeah. And the sounds of battle made their way back to Fort Phil Kearny, and Colonel Carrington sent a detachment of men to go and respond and reinforce and dispel the attackers. So, 27 cavalrymen from the 2nd Cavalry and 49 infantrymen from the 18th Infantry were slated to go out under Captain James Powell, but Captain Fetterman pulled rank and seniority and said, no, they're going out under me. And because he did have that rank and seniority, he kind of acquiesced.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Carrington was believed to have ordered the relief party that they were under no circumstances to pursue over Lodge Trail Ridge, which would take them out of the sight of the fort and make them vulnerable to attack. Whether that happened or not is something that historians have debated, but nevertheless, when Fetterman did lead his people over Lodge Trail Ridge, it did kind of open them up to attack. It's
to not to being wiped out.
Yeah, historians have debated whether Fetterman led his troops in that direction as part of like a flanking maneuver to try to get around the back of where the Indians were attacking the wagon train, or if some of the decoy guys had mooned them.
Yeah.
And he
allegedly Crazy Horse. That was one of the first appearances in Battle of the Lakota Crazy Horse.
Yeah. And supposedly he had been mooned by some of these decoys, and he just took such a big affront to this that was enough to make him pursue these guys. Whatever happened, he ended up leading his men directly into an ambush. 40 minutes of fighting later, all 81 men in his command were dead. Shortly after word of the attack had made its way back to Fort Phil Kearny, another backup force had been sent by Carrington.
Tenek was the commander of that.
Yes. Yeah. By the time he got there, nothing he could have done. Everyone was already dead. They'd been stripped, mutilated. It was a mess.
Yep. And Carrington had put the women and children in the powder house in anticipation that if the Native Americans breached the fort, they'd blow up the powder house to prevent them from being taken captive.
Which, I saw that, and that's just bold, if nothing else. Bold or crazy or desperate or
well, considering what happened to captives, you can understand it, I guess. So my information would say that the Spencer carbines were issued to the band. Figure that out, right? So then when the wagon train, they were sent out to relieve the wagon train, the Spencers were transferred to Grumman's cavalry, right? And so the cavalry being more mobile, this is my theory, all right? My theory is that Grumman, who within a few weeks prior to this incident had almost fallen into an ambush outside of Fort Phil Kearny, my theory is, and he was an impetuous idiot and a bigamist. He was married to 2 women at the same time. Oh. So my theory is Grumman, impetuous idiot, went over the hill, got in the hot fight, and what do you do as Fetterman when you hear your compatriots in a fight? You go over the hill. I'm a Fetterman fan, I guess. and the remark about give me 80 men and I'll ride through the Sioux Nation my research would say that didn't come up until Carrington's. He had two wives, right? Not at the same time. He was married when he got to Fort Phil Kearny.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently, after his first wife passed away, he married Grumman's widow.
Oh, wow.
And they both wrote books about the incident, the Fetterman Fight. And of course, Carrington was blamed, right? He was in charge. He's the man at the top. He was blamed for it. But there was a concentrated effort by Carrington and his consecutive wives to blame it on Fetterman. And Fetterman saw combat in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And my research, the reading I've done, would say that he had a certain amount of respect for the Native Americans. So historians can differ in their interpretation.
And I'd also seen that Fetterman had a pretty illustrious, by all standards, career, a pretty spotless record.
Mm-hmm.
So would he have disobeyed an order? Maybe, I don't know. That's for historians that are more well-versed on it than myself.
I'm not well-versed, but that doesn't stop me from having strong opinions.
Yeah. Either way, at the end of the day, Carrington had lost between 20 and 25% of his command in the course of less than 6 months.
Yeah.
He had sent a messenger, a gentleman by the name of Portuguese Phillips,
mm-hmm.
To Fort Laramie to inform him of what had happened and to send reinforcements and as many Spencers as he could spare.
Really? I didn't know about the Spencers. Makes sense.
And
because they were all gone. The ones he had, the ones that belonged to the band, were all in Native American hands at this point.
But yeah, it was Portuguese Phillips made it to Fort Laramie, interrupted a full-dress Christmas dinner because it was on December 25th of 1866. Yep. Commanding general there at the fort, mm-hmm. Fort Laramie, immediately relieved Carrington of command. He, regardless of whether or not he was found innocent of any wrongdoing by inquiries by the Army, which he was acquitted of wrongdoing, he was still the top guy on the totem pole. He was
sidelined thereafter.
Yeah, and he still, rightly or wrongly, had to fight to try to clear his name for the rest of his life. And at the end of the day, 81 men were dead.
Yep. So one of the interesting things to me, you mentioned it's a lever action, and by working the action, it does feed a fresh cartridge, but the hammer has to be cocked manually.
So, which was interesting because at the time that this was introduced, the Henry rifle had been introduced.
Same here, 1870 for both of them.
And it would cock and feed around in the same operation.
And there were 2 Henry rifles at the Fetterman Fight.
Oh, really?
There were 2 civilians who had Henry rifles, Wheatley and Fisher.
Yes.
And they asked to go along so we could try out our new Henrys. And I guess they had the opportunity.
Yeah.
So, and also at the Wyoming State Museum, we have a Colt 1851 Navy that belonged to Carrington.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah.
Again, all these people connect. Well, that was an interesting story. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate it.
And one more thing.
Sure.
One more tangent. Sometimes people call us up because in addition to the Wyoming Pioneer Memorial Museum, we also administer Fort Fetterman State Historic Site.
Right.
That is not directly connected to Fetterman or the Fetterman Fight at all in any way.
Really?
Fort Fetterman was named after Captain Fetterman, but that was because at the time, Army custom was to name forts after the most recently killed in action Army officer.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, it just so happened to be Fetterman.
All right. Okay. So the Spencer Carbine,
mm-hmm.
one of the very early successful repeating breech-loading firearms. So if you got questions about the Spencer or want more information on the Fetterman Fight and Fort Phil Kearny, you can contact either Doyle here at the Wyoming Pioneer Memorial Museum, or I'd be glad to talk to you with what I think I know about that situation. If you call the Wyoming State Museum, whoever answers the phone will take a message and get back to me. So once again, I appreciate being here. Thank you so much for sharing your time and stories. And thank you all out there for watching and supporting the channel.